Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Sunday night video. This week I am covering what became known as the Great Fire of Gateshead, which also spread to Newcastle, which took place in 1854 and resulted in the loss of at least 54 lives. I hope you will find it interesting. And I just want to add that I am currently full of cold, so I am recording this while I could be sniffing a little bit, but I am trying not to sniff too much because I don't want it to spoil the video with me sniffing all over the place. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. It is completely free to subscribe. It doesn't cost you any money, but it really does help to support the channel. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. At around 12:30 a.m. on October the 6th, 1854, a fire was discovered in a worsted factory belonging to J. Wilson and Sons, which stood in the Hillgate area of Gateshead. Worsted, in case anybody's interested, is a type of yarn used to make suits, etc. Although every effort was made to bring the fire under control, the use of oil previously on the premises that had no doubt seeped into the wooden floors had made the task impossible, and in less than an hour the entire building had been destroyed. Now, I don't believe that I have seen any photos of the factory, but this plaque, which is on one of the pillars of the Tyne Bridge, shows the place where the factory once stood. Next to this factory stood the 7-storey building known as Bertram's Warehouse. Originally built for use by Bertram and Spencer, it was no longer used by them and was in fact used by the merchants of Newcastle and Gateshead as a free warehouse for storage of their various goods. And a lot of the items stored were chemicals which were highly flammable. Because of this, and because the fire was already spreading, a lot of effort was put into trying to stop the fire before it reached this building. A group of around 50 soldiers from the barracks in Newcastle was sent for, along with their own fire engine, to try and help. But by 3 a.m. Bertram's warehouse was ablaze, and the news of the fire had spread rapidly around Gateshead and also in Newcastle. Hundreds of people began to gather on the old Tyne Bridge and also all along the quayside on the Newcastle side, which did give them a very clear view of the fire on the other side of the Tyne. No doubt those who had gathered in these locations would have felt that they were a safe distance away to not be in any danger. Although, like I have mentioned in the past in other videos, I cannot quite understand why you would want to get up in the middle of the night to go and watch a fire. Just after 3 a.m, a strange sound was heard coming from the direction of the fire, and the newspapers of the time described it as sounding like a gunshot. This, however, did not seem to worry any of the watching crowds, but it was sadly a warning of what was about to come. In less than 3 minutes, a huge explosion took place at the warehouse in Gateshead. It was so loud, it was said, that the buildings around both Newcastle and Gateshead seemed to shake with the shock, and people standing on the old stone Tyne Bridge said they clearly felt that shake as well. In the days after the explosion, reports in the local papers said that vibrations from the explosion were felt as far away as Hexham. And one report even suggested that colliery workers in Monk Wearmouth, deep underground at the time, heard the sound and feared for their lives, returning to the surface, believing that it was an explosion at their own colliery. The sound, though, was perhaps the least damaging part of the explosion. It was such a great force that it sent showers of bricks, timber and other burning materials in every direction. So forceful that stones were thrown in the air, landing as far away as some of the houses in Pilgrim Street in Newcastle. The debris showered down with devastating effect on all those in the area, on the bridge, on the quayside and on those who had been trying to put out the original fire. After the explosion, an eerie silence fell on the area for a few seconds, as if the world had completely stood still and the people had been frozen in time. And after the brightness of the fire, it was said that the area was plunged for a few seconds into darkness. But then the sounds of screams and panic began to fill the air, with the awful smell from the chemicals causing some people to become insensible for a time, a smell which lingered in the air for several days after the explosion, and the flames of the fire lit the skies once again. Fires were now burning on both sides of the quayside, and many people lay dead and injured, with many on the Gateshead side, those closest to the explosion, buried under the rubble of the building that had fallen in Hillgate. The fire engines employed in the job of extinguishing the fire were now mostly buried and useless, and the fires on both sides of the Tyne burnt without control, spreading even further as they went from house to house. Hillgate and Gateshead was the worst area for the debris. Almost everyone who had been there close to the warehouse had been buried by the burning rubble or seriously injured, and many of those buried were well-known people of the town who, like all of the other volunteers, had come out into the night to offer their help. Damage all around was immense. St Mary's Church in Gateshead, which was high above Bertram's warehouse, was in serious danger of destruction. Stones and burning timber had rained down on the building, and a couple of large stones were later found lying amongst the pews inside the church. Mr. James Mather of South Shields was able to get inside the church at great risk to his own life, and with the use of a remaining fire engine pump was able to extinguish the fire, and it was suggested that the clock had stopped at around 3:10, the estimated time of the explosion. On the Newcastle side of the quayside, the fire raged in every direction, spreading along the buildings on the quayside, and it seems forming a kind of arc to spread towards Butcher's Bank from both sides of the quay. Many buildings were destroyed by fire and others by fallen rubble, and very few escaped in the areas such as Sandhill and the Side. And along with the earlier mentioned stones, burning timber also fell into buildings as far away as Pilgrim Street. All Saints' Church, another building that is high above the quayside and a good distance away from the source of the explosion, was found with a huge beam of wood around 6 foot long on its roof. Again, another clear example of how great the force of the explosion was. And some reports also stated that the windows of the church were all blown out, but I do not know how true that part is. The following morning, as daylight began to creep in, the full extent of the damage was clear for all to see. Help was needed to control the fires, and places as far away as Hexham, Morpeth and Berwick, among many others, sent fire engines to the scene. Now you can just imagine how long that would have taken. Today, some of those fire engines would arrive quite quickly, but back in 1864 it would have taken hours to travel from Berwick to Gateshead. In the meantime, anything not burning that could be moved was pulled away from the area, and more soldiers and more firemen and locals began to work to not only stop the flames, but also to begin to look for those buried under the rubble. All around on the quayside and the Tyne Bridge, those uninjured began to work to move those dead or dying from the scene. People were carried on whatever could be found, doors and boards, in fact anything at all that would support a body. The Royal Infirmary at Forth Banks in Newcastle was soon filled to capacity, with an estimated 58 seriously ill patients who were admitted, and a further 63 who would be able to return home after treatment. Many others were taken to the Gateshead dispensary, where they were also treated for their various injuries. This was no doubt a little closer for those who were not so seriously injured, although some would later be sent on to the Newcastle Infirmary. The area around Church Street, which lies behind St Mary's Church and well above the warehouse, was also greatly damaged, and many of the injured had been in this area. By some miracle, those in Gateshead and Newcastle were able to slowly get control over the fires, and now the job of finding the bodies of those buried in the Hillgate area could begin in earnest, something it seems no man should ever have to see. The first bodies found were Mr. Patterson, Mr. Hamilton, Ensign Painter, Corporal Stevenson, Mr. Willis, Mr. Duke and his son, and Mr. McKenny. On October the 8th, the badly damaged body of Mr. Mosley was found, close beside a body that was so badly disfigured the only means of identification were a bunch of keys, and this body was Mr. Alexander Dobson, the son of the well-known architect of Newcastle, John Dobson. Other bodies found were that of Mr. Sharp, who was identified by his gold watch, Mr. Davison, who was identified by his signet ring, Mr. Harrison, who was identified by a cigar case, and an unnamed fireman who was still clutching a fire hose. And in Church Walk, the Hart family were found, husband, wife, and 2 young children. Sadly, one of those known to have been in the area at the time, Mr. Bertram, was not found at all. All that could be seen of his remains were a snuff box and a key that were known to have belonged to him. It must have been horrendous for the volunteers trying to find those buried in the rubble, to only find keys and rings, etc., and no real sign of the person they once belonged to. A short time later, an inquest was held into the cause of the explosion. I will not go into great detail about this, as most of the information about this part of the inquest is quite technical. 2 men seem to give the most information, with one suggesting the water on the chemicals had caused steam, which had reached very high temperatures, causing the explosion, while another man, Professor Taylor, felt that the chemicals had given off noxious gas, which had eventually exploded. There had been much speculation in the area that the warehouse had been filled with gunpowder, and although the 2 experts did not quite agree on how it had exploded, neither men believed any gunpowder had been present. And the jury at this particular inquest, after much discussion, came to the same agreement, that no gunpowder had been present, and that the whole explosion had been a tragic accident. An inquest was also held on the bodies of those who had died at the Newcastle Infirmary. Mr. John Wilson, who was the worsted manufacturer who owned the building where the fire first broke out, said he had been alerted of the fire between 11 and 12 p.m. and had gone into the factory and found the top floor on fire. He said he had called for assistance but had not been able to extinguish the fire. He could not account for how it had started. He said he slept in an adjoining building and had checked the premises at both 7:30 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. and all had been well. He thought that although the fire had started in the room above where the chimney was, where a fire burned at all times, he also felt it was far too far away to have caused it. And only one man had been working in the room where the fire had broken out, and he had left at around 7:30 p.m. The inquest was adjourned several times, and there were lots of witnesses called and many experts also called. And while I would usually cover the entire inquest details, it is incredibly long, and it would result in this video being about an hour long or more. So I feel it's best to not include all the details in this video. However, if anyone would like to hear all the information from the various parts of the inquest, then do please let me know in the comments below, and I will do a separate extra inquest video at a later date. The jury in this particular case, after hearing the evidence from the experts on the bodies of those who had died, and also from the people who had been in the area at the time and the families who had lost loved ones, they retired for 2 hours before returning a verdict that the deaths of all those who had perished in the explosion and the following fires had been purely accidental. Among the stories of tragic loss of life, one story of an amazing escape was told. It was noted that a house in Hillgate had been examined and two young children had been found inside, both unharmed but very hungry. Although sadly these children were never named and it was never mentioned if their parents had perished in the fire, nor did the newspaper say what had happened to them after they had been found. Among the causes of death, some had died from shock, others had been crushed or lost limbs, and of those injured, the injuries ranged from bruises to burns, to losing an eye due to flying stones, and also losing an arm due to being hit by a flying boulder. And I have seen a full list of not just those who died, but also those who were injured in the explosion, and while I would love to name them all, there's simply far too many to mention. On October the 13th, Queen Victoria was passing through the area on her way back to London from Scotland. They stopped off at Newcastle, where they had tea with the mayors of both Newcastle and Gateshead. Queen Victoria asked how many people had died in the explosion, and the mayor of Gateshead said he was as yet unable to confirm the number. She then expressed her great sympathy at the loss of life and expressed a wish to donate 100 guineas to the relief fund. On continuing their journey, the train paused on the high-level bridge so that Queen Victoria was able to see for herself the devastation left behind. Prince Albert had spoken to the mayor of Gateshead asking if they planned to rebuild the homes at Hillgate, and was told that they did not, thinking the area would simply become a public quayside. And Prince Albert stated that he felt this was for the best, as they had been areas frequently plagued with cholera, and was heard to state that it was quite true that sometimes good things came from bad. No doubt he was meaning that the loss of the homes would also mean no more cholera in that area. I did not find details of the many burials to take place after the explosion, but I did find some very basic information about Alexander Dobson, who was buried in Jesmond Old Cemetery, and the newspapers reported at the time that very few people had been invited to attend the service. His father, John Dobson, would also later be buried in the same location, and I believe from some information that I read recently that the headstone was not put in place until around 1905. Now this might explain the rather strange information about Alexander, which I'm sure you can see from this photo on screen at the moment, which states on the headstone that he died on October the 4th, 1864, when of course he did not actually die until October the 6th. So perhaps whoever placed the stone there simply did not know the correct date of the explosion. In the first few days after the explosion, and once the fire was extinguished, it was said that the towns of Gateshead and Newcastle were visited by upwards of 20,000 people, some who came to sympathise with the people of the area, some who came to mourn those who had died, but many more who simply came to see the scene of devastation, and many were heard to say they would never see anything like it again. Special trains had to be put on to accommodate the extra passengers heading to the scene of the explosion. And a relief fund was soon set up to support orphans and widows and those who had lost their homes and all of their belongings. It was said that upwards of £11,000 was raised, and this would be somewhere in the region of 1,700,000 in today's money. And it was estimated that over 800 families applied for help from the fund. And some money remained after the families had been helped, and this was shared out between the Royal Infirmary, the Gateshead Dispensary, and also the ragged schools of the area. In the weeks and months to come, the towns of both Gateshead and Newcastle would have faced the massive clean-up operation and also the work to rebuild their towns. And if you look at this photo of the quayside taken from the boundary wall of St Mary's Church, you can see signs of some of the older buildings on the quayside, but which ones have been rebuilt is hard to tell. And you can also see the spire of All Saints' Church in the distance, giving you an idea of how far the debris from the explosion had to travel. And stones that had fallen inside St Mary's Church lay in the grounds for many years, with a plaque stating where they were from. And the photos you can see on screen at the moment show you firstly the stones themselves, which as you can see are not tiny little things, so the force must have been great to send them flying up in the air to the church roof. And as previously said, it stands high on a hill above where the warehouse once stood, so it would have taken some effort for the stones to get up there. And the second photo shows you the plaque that was originally placed next to the stones, which is now set into an outer wall of the church boundary, which tells you that the stones, along with the burning timber and red-hot iron bars, were blown onto the roof and into the church. And the third and final photo shows the new plaque, which is actually a paving stone in the ground, which states that the stones were moved in February of 1985, although I must admit I'm not really sure why they were moved. And it was somewhat of an odd feeling standing next to these stones, trying to imagine how it must have felt for those in the area at the time, maybe seeing them flying through the air and not knowing where they might land, and probably being too paralysed with fear to run away, although it is very doubtful there was anywhere to run. There's very little that can be said to end this story, a tragic accident that led to the loss of many lives. Even if people had stayed in their homes and not gone out to watch the fire, it seems many would have still been injured or killed due to the mass spread of the debris around such a wide area, and the fact that it not only set other buildings on fire, but also destroyed them with fallen stones and boulders. 2 towns in parts left in ruins, and many injured and needing support to find homes after theirs had been destroyed by either fire or fallen debris. I can't even begin to imagine what it must have been like for those involved. It must have been terrifying to see the explosion, to not know what to do as bricks, stones, iron and boulders fell from the sky to the ground where you were standing. It must have been awful. Was the cause of the original fire ever found? Was anyone ever held accountable for the strange flammable chemicals kept in the warehouse? Something we shall probably never know the answers to. As always, I will still ask you what you think, but more so this time asking you if you would have gone out to watch the fire in the middle of the night, or, like me, would you have kept well away? And what do you think it would have been like to live through such a disaster? Do please let me know your thoughts on this story in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very tragic story interesting, and I do hope that my couple of sniffing problems in the middle of the video haven't bothered you too much. I think I managed to get through a lot better than I was expecting to, probably because one side of my nose is completely clogged up and I can't breathe out of it at all. But anyway, I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.